Then the flood swept over. 4 words. That is all the tablet gives us. No temple courtyards, no altars, no carved doorways from the world it erased. That line between 2 lists of kings like a hinge cut into stone. Before it, 5 cities, 8 kings. Reign lengths so absurd they read like myth, not record. After it, a world we can excavate, date, and name. But the cities before the flood, the sacred centres those kings ruled, left no trace anyone has found. The record remembers a world existed. It never shows what it looked like. I came across the Sumerian King List while looking for something else entirely, trying to track when temple inventories first appear in Mesopotamian administrative records, the dry kind of question that usually leads nowhere interesting. Instead, it led here, to a document copied and recopied for over 1,000 years, surviving today mostly on a single clay prism kept in Oxford's Ashmolean Museum, 4 sides of cuneiform wrapped around a wedge of baked clay, with fragments of the same traditions scattered across museum collections from Berlin to Baghdad. The prism itself dates to roughly 1800 BCE, inscribed by a scribe recording traditions that were already ancient in his own time. The list was compiled centuries after the events it claims to describe. Drawn from older king lists and oral memory, the scribes themselves no longer fully understood. And near the very beginning, before anything resembling history as we'd recognise it, the list does something strange. It gets specific. 5 cities, it says. Eridu first, the city tradition remembered as the oldest of all, the seat of the god Enki, and the place where, according to the same tradition, kingship itself first descended to earth. Its first king is named Alulim, reigning a number of years no honest translation can make literal, then Bad-tibira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak, whose last king, Tutu, is the final name before everything changes. 8 kings rule across those 5 cities, one after another, kingship passing from city to city like something physical being handed off rather than inherited. The scribes record each king's name. They record how long each one reigned, and the numbers are absurd. Tens of thousands of years per king, reigns that stretch the imagination past any reasonable reading of history and into something closer to myth. Modern scholars have proposed explanations: a different counting system, a symbolic use of large numbers, a deliberate inflation meant to convey antiquity rather than literal duration. None of the explanations fully resolve it. What's left is a record that is precise about names, precise about order, precise about succession, and almost mathematically absurd about time. Then, mid-sentence, the list breaks. Then the flood swept over. That's it. 4 words in most translations, sometimes 5 depending on the source tablet and how a given scholar renders the verb. After those words, the list picks back up as though nothing unusual had happened. Kingship is lowered from heaven again, this time at the city of Kish, and a new sequence of dynasties begins. Dynasty scholars can eventually cross-reference against real archaeological layers, real material culture, a chronology that starts to behave like history rather than memory. The flood line is the hinge. Everything after it is, in some rough sense, recoverable. Everything before it exists only as a list of names and numbers. Here's what struck me, going through the translations slowly rather than skimming them the way I had at first. The scribes who compiled this list were not vague people. They were the opposite, meticulous record keepers, the same administrative culture that gave us tax ledgers, grain receipts, legal contracts, beer rations counted out by the litre, and temple inventories detailed enough to count individual sheep by colour and owner. This was a civilization that wrote down everything, often obsessively, in lists very similar in form to this one. And yet, for the 5 cities that supposedly existed before the flood, the one thing they never wrote down was what those cities actually looked like. No description of a temple, no mention of an altar, a courtyard, a processional way, a carved threshold. Nothing about where the kings prayed, or to whom, or in what kind of building. The list remembers that kingship existed in those cities. It does not remember, or does not say, what the sacred centre of that world looked like. It would be easy to assume archaeology has simply filled in the gap, the way it has for so much of the ancient Near East. It hasn't, not cleanly. Several of the 5 named cities have in fact been located and excavated. Eridu's mound has been dug down through layer after layer in search of its earliest temple, a small shrine to Enki that was rebuilt and enlarged so many times across so many centuries that the earliest version is barely a footprint in the soil. Shuruppak has been identified with the site of Tel Farah, where excavators in the early 20th century found a thick band of water-laid silt sitting in the stratigraphy. Leonard Woolley found a similar flood deposit at sediment consistent with serious prolonged flooding, sitting at roughly the right depth to matter. Kish produced its own confirmed flood layer as well, reported by excavators working there in the 1920s. So the cities are not myths in the sense of being unlocatable. The problem is narrower, and in a way stranger. Nobody has ever confidently pointed to a structure in those early layers and said, "This is what the sacred centre described in the list looked like before the water came. The places exist. The silt exists. The description of what stood at their centre does not. So the list gives us names without architecture, and the ground gives us silt without a clear building to attach it to. Two different kinds of silence, sitting directly on top of each other. Which leaves a fairly simple question, the kind that's easy to skip past if you're reading the list the way most translations present it, as a curiosity, a literary oddity tucked before the real history starts. If Sumerian scribes could remember the names of 5 cities and 8 kings with that kind of precision, names and numbers passed down carefully enough to survive 1,000 years of recopying, across multiple dynasties and political upheavals, what happened to the memory of what those cities' sacred centres actually looked like? Architecture is usually the thing that survives longest in human memory. The shape of a building outlives the names of the people who built it, in most traditions by a wide margin. Here it's the reverse. The names survived in precise, almost bureaucratic detail. The buildings didn't, not even as a single line of description. That gap is exactly where this goes next. Not into the list itself, which has nothing further to give on this particular point, but into what was actually being built in that same general region, in that same general era, long before anyone living in it was writing anything down at all. The next part of this isn't textual at all, it's physical, and it sits in a place no Sumerian scribe ever wrote about, in a layer of time so far back that writing itself hadn't been invented yet, not in Mesopotamia, not anywhere on Earth. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, a low hill in southeastern Turkey, not far from the modern city of Şanlıurfa. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began excavating it in 1995 after noticing worked stone fragments scattered across the surface that local farmers had been ploughing around for decades without anyone asking what they were. What he found underneath changed how an entire generation of archaeologists has to talk about the deep past. Radiocarbon dating, taken from organic material and charcoal sealed in the fill layers, places the earliest construction phases at Göbekli Tepe between roughly 9,600 and 8,200 BCE. To put that in perspective, the Sumerian King List floodline and the earliest layers of cities like Eridu and Shuruppak belong to a world thousands of years closer to us than this. Writing itself, cuneiform, the very thing that gave us the King List in the first place, doesn't appear until around 3,200 BCE. Göbekli Tepe predates the invention of writing by more than 6,000 years. It predates pottery in the region. By most conventional accounts, it predates settled agriculture, or sits right at agriculture's uncertain edge, built by people still living largely off wild grain and hunted game. The people who built it were, by every label archaeology usually applies, hunter-gatherers, and what they built should not, by most of the assumptions that label carries, have been possible. Circular and oval enclosures, cut into bedrock and ringed with massive limestone pillars carved into a T-shape, a flat horizontal capital sitting on top of a vertical shaft, some of them standing over 5 meters tall, some weighing in the range of 10 to 20 tons. The oldest enclosures, the ones Schmidt's team labelled Layer 3, are the largest and earliest. Later, smaller rectangular structures built on top of them, Layer 2, suggest the site itself changed in scale and meaning over centuries of continuous use. Several of the larger pillars are carved in low relief with arms and hands, fingers meeting at the front as if the stones themselves are meant to be read as bodies, not as architecture. Around and between them, the carvings shift to animals, foxes, boars, snakes coiled in dense clusters, scorpions, vultures with wings spread, cranes, aurochs with horns rendered in careful, deliberate detail. None of it is crude. None of it reads as a first attempt. The skill on display looks like the product of a tradition, not an invention happening for the first time on this hill. And what's been excavated is, by most estimates, only a fraction of what's there. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetic surveys across the rest of the hill suggest as many as 20 additional stone enclosures still buried beneath the soil, untouched by any trowel. What's been exposed so far, a handful of enclosures, a few hundred pillars, maybe a small sample of a much larger ritual landscape that took shape over centuries. Archaeologists still argue over exactly what the carvings meant. Some read the vultures and the dismembered-looking imagery on certain pillars as evidence of a death cult, a way of processing the dead through exposure rather than burial. Others read the animal procession more broadly, as a kind of cosmological map, predator and prey, arranged with intention rather than randomly. No single interpretation has won outright. The structures were built with clear intention, maintained over generations and eventually filled back in with rubble and soil. Not abandoned by accident, but buried on purpose, for reasons nobody has fully explained. Moving stone of that weight, shaping it that precisely, and arranging it into enclosures that follow a consistent architectural logic requires organized labor. People coordinated well beyond a single family group, fed and housed long enough to finish the work, directed by someone or something with enough authority to keep dozens of people pulling in the same direction for years. That kind of organization is exactly what the traditional story says shouldn't exist yet. The traditional story has agriculture coming first, surplus food coming second, settled villages third, and only then, once people had the spare time and social structure for it, monumental religious architecture. Schmidt's own reading of the site flipped that sequence. Build the sacred structure first, and let the village grow up around the need to feed the people who kept returning to maintain it. Göbekli Tepe appears to reverse the conventional order, or at minimum scrambles it badly enough that the sequence can no longer be assumed. I want to be precise about what this is and isn't, because it's easy to let two real things blur into one false thing. No cuneiform tablet, no fragment of the Sumerian King List, no text from any literate culture mentions Göbekli Tepe. There is no inscription naming it, no king list placing a ruler there, no claim, anywhere from any ancient source, that this hill was one of the 5 antediluvian cities, or connected to them in any documented way. The gap between Göbekli Tepe and the world of Eridu and Shuruppak is not a few centuries that a stretched memory might bridge. It's on the order of 6,000 years, longer than the distance between the Sumerian King List and us. Anyone claiming a direct named link between the two is claiming something the evidence does not say, and this isn't that claim. What the evidence does say is narrower and arguably stranger. Long before any scribe sat down to record a city, a king, or a flood, people who left no writing at all were already building structures whose entire purpose appears to have been sacred. Enclosures with no domestic debris, no ordinary households, nothing that looks like daily life, only carved pillars, animal imagery, and repeated, deliberate construction on the same spot across generations. Organized ritual architecture, in other words, existed on this hill thousands of years before anyone had a word for temple, the tablets. Remember pre-flood cities and never describe their sacred centers. The stones, separated from those tablets by an almost incomprehensible stretch of time, show what organized sacred building looked like before history had names for any of it. Not the same place, not the same people, the same kind of silence, answered from an entirely different direction. Göbekli Tepe is not alone on its hilltop, and the more of the surrounding landscape gets excavated, the harder it becomes to treat it as a one-off anomaly rather than part of a pattern. About 35 kilometers away, at a site called Karahan Tepe, archaeologists working since 2019 have uncovered more T-shaped pillars, more carved animal imagery, and at least one chamber where dozens of phallic pillars stand in close formation around a single larger figure carved directly into the bedrock, staring out from the rock face as if it had always been waiting there to be uncovered. Radiocarbon work at Karahan Tepe places parts of it in roughly the same window as Göbekli Tepe's earliest phases, close enough in time that researchers now debate which site, if either, came first, rather than treating Göbekli Tepe as a singular point of origin. Much of Karahan Tepe remains unexcavated, with surveys suggesting the visible chambers are only a small piece of a much larger complex still under the soil. Decades earlier, at Nevalı Çori, excavators found the same T-shaped pillar form, the same arm and hand carving convention, in a site now submerged beneath a dam reservoir, lost to fieldwork before further study. Archaeologists working across the wider region have started grouping these and roughly a dozen related sites under a single umbrella, sometimes called the Taş Tepeler, the Stone Hills, a cluster of pre-pottery Neolithic centres spread across a few hundred square kilometres, all sharing the same basic architectural grammar. None of these sites are identical. None of them were built by people who left a single written word. But the shared vocabulary across them, the T-shape, the careful animal carving, the same basic grammar of sacred space, suggests a tradition, not a coincidence, spread across a region and sustained across centuries before anyone in it could write a name down. And then there's what happened to that tradition at Göbekli Tepe specifically, which might be the strangest detail in the whole site. The enclosures weren't simply abandoned when their builders moved on. They were deliberately filled in, backfilled with rubble, broken stone tools and animal bone, packed in tightly enough that the pillars themselves were buried standing upright, preserved almost perfectly by their own burial, sealed in the dark for thousands of years until Schmidt's team uncovered them again. Then, often nearby, a new enclosure would be built, sometimes smaller, sometimes using different stone, as if each structure had a working life with a defined end written into its design from the start. Nobody knows for certain why. Some researchers tie it to the death of whoever the structure was built for. Others read it as the end of a generational cycle, retired like a completed term of office. A few other nearby related Taş Tepeler sites also show similar signs of deliberate backfilling, which argues against a purely local custom and for a shared regional practice. It doesn't read as destruction in anger, and it doesn't read as ordinary decay or neglect. It reads as a closing ceremony for a building, performed deliberately by people who treated that hill's sacred architecture as something with a beginning and a designed end. The same way a person might be buried rather than simply left where they fell. A structure built to be sacred, used for generations, and then ritually entombed rather than allowed to fall down on its own. Which brings the two halves of this back together. On one side, a civilization that wrote down everything: names, kings, reign lengths, sheep counts, grain rations, the smallest household debts, and remembered, in precise administrative detail, that 5 cities existed before a flood, while saying nothing at all about what those cities' sacred centres looked like. No shape, no material, no carved image of anything that stood inside them. On the other side, thousands of years earlier and a region away, people who wrote down nothing, who left no king's name and no number anyone can read, and who nonetheless built and rebuilt and ritually closed monumental sacred architecture across centuries, leaving the structures themselves as the only record of what mattered enough to build in stone. Clay remembers administration. Stone remembers ritual. Clay is good at preserving exact names and exact numbers across 1,000 years of recopying. It is terrible at preserving the look of a room. Stone is the reverse. It preserves form, scale, and craftsmanship almost perfectly, while preserving no name at all. Neither one on its own gives a complete picture of what a temple meant to the people who built the first ones. It's tempting, looking at both records side by side, to want them to connect directly, to want the tablets to be describing the stones, or the stones to be a buried memory of the cities on the list. They almost certainly aren't the same thing. The dates are too far apart, the locations don't overlap, and nothing in either record claims the other. But the absence each one leaves behind is oddly matched, almost like two halves of a single missing object. The Sumerian scribes remembered that sacred kingship existed before the flood and left no description of where it was practiced. The builders at Göbekli Tepe and its neighbours left elaborate, monumental evidence of where sacred practice happened, and left no name for any of it. No king, no city, nothing a later scribe could have copied down even if they'd wanted to. Two different cultures, two different methods of memory, separated by an almost unbridgeable stretch of time, and in both cases, the exact same kind of gap. The form of the sacred, present in one record and missing from the other, never in both at once. So the question from the very beginning of this: what did the sacred centres of the world before the flood actually look like, doesn't get answered by stacking these two records on top of each other. If anything, it gets sharper. Because somewhere in the centuries and millennia between a buried Anatolian hilltop and a clay prism recopied in old Babylon, an entire category of human experience, the literal shape of the sacred, the architecture people built to hold their oldest fears and their oldest gods, passed through human memory in two completely different, completely incompatible forms, and neither form was built to survive intact into the other's hands. What's left isn't an answer. It's two silences, facing each other across thousands of years, each one shaped exactly where the other one speaks. Here's what I keep coming back to. Somewhere in the centuries when both of these records were still alive, when the Sumerian King List was being recopied by scribes in Babylon, and when, thousands of years earlier, the last enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were being filled in and sealed, there was no single person who held both halves of this in their head at once. No scribe ever once stood in front of a T-shaped pillar. No Neolithic builder ever heard the words, "Then the flood swept over." The two records never touched, never crossed paths in any human lifetime, never had the chance to. They are separated by a gap of time longer than the distance from the invention of writing to right now. Longer, in fact, than the entire span of recorded history put together. And that's exactly what makes the shape of the gap between them feel less like an accident and more like a structure of its own. Two silences built independently by people who never knew the other silence existed, and who never could have known. Picture, instead, something smaller and entirely imagined. Not a historical figure, not a named person from either record, but a kind of composite. An old woman in a Sumerian city sometime after the floodline was first written down and carefully copied into the official record, listening to a story passed to her the way every culture passes its oldest stories, mouth to ear, generation to generation, worn smooth by repetition until the rough edges are gone. She knows the names of the cities by heart. She knows the kings, the order they ruled in, maybe even the absurd lengths of their reigns, recited the way children memorize anything repeated enough times. The numbers themselves turned into a kind of song passed down without anyone questioning it. What she does not know, what nobody in her line has known for longer than anyone can say, is what the sacred buildings in those cities actually looked like. Whether they had courtyards, whether the doorways were carved, whether anything stood at their centre the way a pillar stands at Göbekli Tepe's. The knowledge wasn't hidden from her as far as anyone can tell. It simply never made the trip across that many centuries of retelling. Some details survive being passed down for 1,000 years. Names survive, numbers survive, however strange they've become. Architecture, it turns out, is one of the things that usually doesn't. The timeline, laid end to end, isn't subtle once it's all in front of you. Somewhere around 9,600 to 8,200 BCE, people without writing, without pottery, without settled farming as we'd define it, raised T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe, carve them with foxes and vultures and boars, and eventually bury them on purpose, sealing each enclosure the way a chapter gets closed. Nearby hills, Karahan Tepe, Nevalı Çori, and others still being surveyed, show the same basic grammar repeated, a shared tradition rather than a single isolated effort. Thousands of years pass, agriculture spreads, pottery appears, villages grow into towns, towns into cities, writing appears around 3,200 BCE, in the same broader region where the King List cities are later said to have stood. Centuries after that, Sumerian scribes compile a list of kings ruling in 5 cities before a flood, name them, number their reigns, and then write 4 words that end the entire era without a single image attached to it. Then the flood swept over. Around 1800 BCE, a scribe in Babylon copies that list onto a clay prism, preserving the names and burying, just as completely as any backfilled enclosure, whatever picture once existed of what those cities' temples looked like. That prism is acquired for Oxford's collection in the early 1920s and published not long after, by a scholar who had no reason to connect it to a hill in Turkey nobody had heard of yet. In 1995, on that hill, an archaeologist starts digging where farmers had been ploughing around stone fragments for decades, and one piece of that long-buried picture comes back into view. Not the piece the King List was describing, almost certainly not, but a piece of the same general kind of thing. Organised people, before history had names for any of it, building something sacred enough to bury on purpose when its time was done. I want to say this plainly one more time, because it's the kind of thing that gets blurred the moment a story like this gets repeated a few times by people who weren't careful with it the first time, and the blurring happens fast. No tablet names Göbekli Tepe. No king list places a ruler on that hill. The tablets remember pre-flood cities and say nothing about their sacred centres. The stones at Göbekli Tepe show, in extraordinary physical detail, the kind of sacred architecture that existed somewhere in the world before history had a written name for any of it, not proof of what stood in Eridu or Shuruppak, but evidence that the basic question driving this whole inquiry isn't naive: building, remembering, forgetting. That's the cycle on both sides of this, separated by thousands of years, never once overlapping and yet somehow rhyming. There's a smaller, stranger footnote worth sitting with before closing this out. The Sumerian King List isn't actually unique in the way it's often presented. Versions of it, with variations in names and reign lengths, turn up in multiple copies across different cities and centuries, which means the scribes weren't transcribing a single fixed original so much as maintaining a living tradition, one that drifted slightly every time it was recopied. Some versions list a different number of cities, some shuffle the order, a few drop a king entirely or add one nobody else recorded. That instability matters here, because it means even the part of the record that survived wasn't preserved perfectly. Names and numbers blurred too, just less catastrophically than the architecture did. The list didn't outlast the floodline as a single clean photograph passed hand to hand. It outlasted it the way a song outlasts the person who first sang it. Recognizable, durable, but never quite identical twice. Which makes the missing temples less like an isolated gap in an otherwise perfect record, and more like the most extreme edge of a fading that was already happening everywhere else in the text, just more slowly. Has anyone actually sat down and mapped every known pre-pottery Neolithic ritual site against every textual fragment that claims to remember a world before a flood? Not to force a connection that isn't there, but to ask carefully and patiently what each kind of record is good at preserving and what it loses every single time, and whether the pattern holds up once every flood tradition and every excavated hill is laid out side by side. As far as I can tell, nobody has done that systematically across every culture that kept a flood story and every site old enough to predate it. The Sumerian King List is still sitting in Oxford, still readable, still missing the one description it never thought to include. Göbekli Tepe is still being excavated, one enclosure at a time, with most of the hill and most of its neighbours still unopened beneath the soil, waiting on whoever picks up a trowel next. Between them lies a question nobody has fully answered. What did the first temples actually look like, before anyone had the words or the writing to tell us? The tablets remember the world. The stones might show us its shape. Neither one is finished speaking, and neither one on its own was ever going to be enough.